Hello everyone. Welcome to the South Carolina Community Loan Fund's Investing in Community Summit Series. The Summit Series is a monthly panel discussion focusing on the mission areas of South Carolina Community Loan Fund. I'm Kelly Sharkey, the Program Manager here at SCCLF. This afternoon, we will be discussing how nonprofit organizations can use alternative sources of funding like loans to help fulfill their organization's missions. Nonprofits can't always rely on grants or fundraising to secure the capital they need to meet their mission. Debt can actually help nonprofits expand to better meet their mission. In the sixth installment of the Summit series, we will discuss the various scenarios where nonprofits have used debt from financial institutions like the South Carolina Community Loan Fund to serve their communities. We have a great panel of 4 nonprofit experts to dig deeper into this discussion here this afternoon. Before we jump in, just have a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions during the session, we ask that you type them in the question feature on the GoToWebinar control panel. We will have 10 minutes for question and answers before concluding at 2 o'clock. This session will be recorded and automatically emailed to everyone who registered through GoToWebinar. We will also post it on our Summit Series YouTube page for you to access at any time. I have included in the handout section of the control panel the contact information for today's panelists. So please feel free to download that PDF for more information. And our moderator today is Sadia Bellamy. She is the Midlands Community Loan Officer here at South Carolina Community Loan Fund. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it off to Sadia and our panelists.
Thank you, Kelly. We definitely want to appreciate everyone for attending today. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. All right. So definitely want to appreciate or thank everyone for attending today, and definitely thank you to our panelists for making this happen today. So I want to start out first with allowing you guys to introduce yourselves and talk about, give us a little background on your organization and the type of work that you do in the community and your roles in the organization as well. And we can start with Stacy, since Stacy is the first person on my screen.
Okay. I'm Stacy Deneau, and I'm the CEO of 180 Place, and we are headquartered in Charleston, but we have offices in North Charleston and Columbia, so we serve about half of the state from a county count perspective, and we work to end and prevent homelessness, and we do it in a number of ways, everything from street outreach all the way to moving people and supporting people once they're in permanent housing. And kind of the in-between sometimes for folks is actually coming to the homeless shelter. So our focus is on ending homelessness, and we do that in a myriad of ways, and we'll get into how the Community Loan Fund has really enhanced our mission over the last several years a little bit later.
Thank you, Stacy. And Benjamin?
Hi, I'm Ben Bullock. I'm the Director of Operations at Together SC. We're the State Association of Nonprofit and Philanthropic Organizations. Our mission is to unite, strengthen, and advance South Carolina's nonprofit and philanthropic organizations. And we are based in Columbia, but all of our staff are based in their own homes for the foreseeable future. But we have staff in Charleston, here in Columbia, and up in Greenville. Yeah, that's what we do.
Okay. And Tammy?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Tammy Hoy Hawkins. I'm the CEO here at Community Works Carolina. We are based in Greenville, but we are statewide. We are a community development financial institution. Our partner, South Carolina Community Loan Fund, we work closely with them to finance underserved and underrepresented populations and communities with a primary focus of people of color and communities of color. We do small business lending, we do nonprofit lending, we also do affordable housing, community facilities lending across the state, and we wrap all that around with financial coaching, business coaching, and technical assistance. And so we're very much focused on asset building for communities, and so thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Tammy. And Carrie?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Carrie. I'm the Executive Director for Strand Housing. We serve the Low Country area, Horry, Georgetown, and Williamsburg counties doing housing rehab, and we also provide rental housing for low-income families in our area.
All right, thank you, Carrie, and thank you all for those introductions. So let's start first by dispelling the myth that all debt is bad. Some debt is actually good, such as business investments. If you could, maybe Tammy, if you could start, maybe tell us some of the reasons that nonprofits do shy away from seeking out loans. And if you guys could chime in with how your organizations have used loans to help meet your mission's goals.
Sure, I'll jump in first. And again, yeah, I think there can be a misnomer on the availability of credit. Again, a lot of times nonprofits need to access credit to not only get lines of credit for operations, which can be very supportive, in particular if they're looking for a grant reimbursables. A lot of us as nonprofits get grants and then we have to expend the money and then we have to get reimbursement. And many of us may not have the cash flow necessary to do that. I know just with even COVID recently, we've seen a lot more need for that. In addition, one of the number one things is just making sure that your board and that has the authority to take on debt. So that's really a very simple process, a resolution allowing the organization to get a line of credit or to access a loan for a specific project. Some nonprofits may not be in direct services, but maybe they're building or doing development, so they may need financing for their development projects. And in some cases, traditional financial institutions or organizations like us and South Carolina Community Loan Fund can be that resource. But to your point, I think there's always a hesitation, whether it be for the organization or a board of directors, but sometimes having that access to funding immediately can really benefit you, can expedite your goals, can expedite your impact, can enable you. They always say, ask for money when you have money. So sometimes, having the access to a line of credit, especially when, especially times like now, right? Preparing yourself for a crisis, when maybe, you didn't have those events that you thought you were going to have because of COVID or because of some other issue. So your fundraising is behind, but now that you have that access to a line of credit, in many cases, you're only really paying for that when you draw it down. So there's a lot of reasons why I think people kind of shy away from it, but certainly it can be a great resource for you to accelerate your community efforts and your impact.
Thank you, Tammy. And any of you guys can jump in if you want to talk about, how you've used debt for your organization and your mission within your organization. Ben?
I can chime on this from a general perspective. I definitely agree with Tammy that many in the nonprofit sector, especially on boards who are primarily volunteer leaders in the business world or in the government world, have in their minds this deeply ingrained idea that nonprofits are not supposed to do certain things that businesses do, and they're not supposed to get to a certain size, and that one of those things is not taking on debt. Many nonprofit organizations don't have the kind of solid, reliable revenue streams that businesses have, or don't think about those revenue streams in those same ways. And so whenever the question of debt comes up, when somebody says, well, then how are we going to pay for that? If we don't know, what our revenue stream is going to be like, we might not be able to pay it off. And I think a lot of work needs to be done to dispel a lot of myths about how nonprofits function, but that's one of them. And from Together SC's perspective, I mean, we're an association, but we're actually a relatively small organization, and we're virtual, we're lean, we don't have any physical plants at all, and so we haven't had a need to take on debt for any capital expenses until the PPP loan program came out. And so even then there was a discussion amongst our staff and some of our board members about, well, it's a loan. What does that look like for us? And once we were certain that it was going to be very forgivable, then we didn't have as much reticence about it. But for me, that was the first kind of loan process I'd ever undertaken from a company corporate perspective. So it was a fascinating experience.
I think one of the myths that I've worked all my career to dispel, and I think our board agrees that nonprofit is our tax status. It's not our business plan. And so really ask board members, don't check your business hat when you walk in our boardroom or join our board Zoom, and make decisions as if you were in your own business. Use that business acumen. And so that has really helped us over the years to use pretty much every debt instrument out there, from lines of credit, the simpler things, lines of credit and credit cards, to mortgages for construction, refinancing those mortgages and pulling out cash based on the equity in our project, bridge loans to complete a project. And it does strengthen the balance sheet. It certainly lines of credit, as Tammy and Ben have said, about managing cash flow when you're waiting on a reimbursement, pulling down those lines of credit. So I think the first thing is getting your board, if they're not there, stop thinking about us as something other than. The only difference between our for-profit and your not-for-profit is where the profit goes at the end of the year, and how we wouldn't be where we are, certainly in a facility, but also just being able to use debt over the years to build capacity beyond those the physical plant, and really enhancing all aspects of programming, operational. But that first is changing, switching that mindset around. We're just like every other business, just the difference is where the positive change in net asset goes at the end of the year.
So our organization has used several of the same tools that Stacy mentioned. We wouldn't actually be able to operate without using debt. We do housing rehab, and depending on what kind of grants you use, most of those are reimbursable. So unless you have that kind of money stacked, which most nonprofits don't, you have to use a line of credit of some sort to pay and use that responsibly. So you wouldn't take out a line of credit usually and just use it for whatever. You would have a purpose for it, just as you have a mission. And as long as you stick to your purpose and your mission and use that responsibly, it's a tool, it's a business tool and a building block that nonprofits can absolutely benefit from.
Thank you.
I was just going to add real quick, Sadia, on a couple of the products that were mentioned. Another strategy that I have seen where nonprofits can utilize access to either credit or a line of credit is during a capital campaign. And so in some cases, again, because whether you're doing a capital campaign, as Stacy mentioned, for a physical plan or a project or a development or housing like Carrie was talking about, but a lot of times, banks and even organizations like ours, those pledges that you get, and sometimes will be eligible to get financing to get that money now versus later. And we've seen it where foundations have come in and guaranteed that line of credit as a way to support you, right? So there's some really innovative ways that you may have a 2-year capital campaign, but you've really got to, you've got a project, as you said, Carrie, it's really going to hit, you've got to build it now because of the timing. And so sometimes that can be difficult, but that's just another way to think about how do you get cash now for a longer term pledge.
You're absolutely right, Tammy. And when you talk about the CDFIs and such as us, and also the banking or financial institutions, other financial institutions, what would you want others to know as far as the benefit of using the CDFI versus a bank, or how they can help one another, or vice versa?
Yeah, in many cases, we work hand in hand with banks. Banks are usually our largest investors and partners, and a lot of times we're doing referrals. And so, we here at Community Works and you guys, we're not a depository institution, so we're not necessarily doing your banking and your checking. And so number one, those relationships would be my first stop, is to talk with my banking partner where I have my deposits to see, what kinds of financing products they may have available. But a lot of times we get referrals from banks, because they have a lot stricter requirements. They are regulated. We're regulated by our board and by the CDFI fund, but we don't have the same types of due diligence required as some of the financial institutions. So sometimes we can be more flexible and we can take a higher risk. So sometimes we might be able to come in on a project, to get it started, where a bank will come in after us and take us out, or we might be the last money in a project to actually finish the project. And so we've got that flexibility because we are mission based and we are focused on trying to facilitate, community economic development and serve those individuals. Now, I will say there's still a due diligence process we still have to, we have a responsibility to our investors. And as Carrie mentioned, sometimes we're getting, government funding, sometimes we're getting private funding. So our funds are, we have requirements for those. So nonprofits still have to go through underwriting. They still have to do a due diligence process to make sure that they can, they have the ability to repay the loan back. We don't want to get the nonprofit in a worse situation, right? So we want to make sure that they have the capacity to repay the loan. So sometimes I know there's a misnomer that just because we're a nonprofit loan fund and we care about the community, that our process may be a little bit easier than the bank, but it's still a process.
That's absolutely correct, Tammy. And if you guys could maybe talk about some of the challenges you faced as far as like going through the application process, some things that you may have learned that you didn't know prior.
So we started out doing the housing rehab, but then we clearly saw the need for affordable rental housing, especially here in Horry County. So we wanted to create a rental program, and without CDFI, South Carolina Community Loan Fund in this case, we just wouldn't have been able to start that. The banks had no reason to take us seriously. They're not mission-based. They're looking at the bottom line and the numbers, and the rents that we would receive through this type of housing is much lower. It's much less profitable when you just look at it based on a number standpoint versus a mission and something that you're providing to the community. So in our case, it was absolutely beneficial to go to South Carolina Community Loan Fund because they were interested in that mission and were willing, like Tammy said, to be able to kind of see the risk differently. So in some cases, to get started with something, you have to find someone who's going to be able to see kind of the bigger picture versus just what you're coming in as when you're getting started with a big project.
Yeah, I think Tammy touched on capital campaigns and pledges, and our friends in the banking community, and I saw a couple names on the participant list, or some of our partners out there. Often outside of sort of the community development folks, a traditional lender doesn't understand a campaign and doesn't understand pledges and a pledge schedule. What do you mean you're going to get the money 5 years down the road? And so having South Carolina Community Loan Fund, a Community Works, who's already kind of given the stamp of approval, gives you some credibility with the bank. And in our case, we use the CDFI lending to close the gap. So then the banker saw, oh, well, if you're waiting on $1 million over 5 years, you have $1 million or whatever the number was right now to go to closing. That they understand. Like, we have the cash at closing. How you pay it back is then predicated upon those pledges. And so the pledges then became essentially the collateral for the loan. It really gives you the credibility. And I think I was surprised several years ago when we did our first capital campaign at just really the lack of understanding in the traditional lending community about how a campaign works and how pledges work. Well, CDFIs, most of you from a personal standpoint or professional standpoint were in this chair or Carrie's chair or Ben's chair at one point. So you really understand how we operate and how we function, and understand the needs that we're trying to meet. So getting that first in money. The other cool thing that I didn't realize would be such an amazing benefit that it ended up being is, in our case, the South Carolina Community Loan Fund was willing to take a lien position behind everybody else. So everybody else wanted to be first, but the Community Loan Fund said, no, we understand the role we play. We can take on more of that risk. And so we're willing to take a subordinate lien position. That again gave the banks, the traditional lenders, a level of comfort that they're in line first should something go wrong. Thankfully, it never did. We paid off all the debt. But again, it was back to that building the credibility with the traditional lender that, yeah, the CDFI gets it. The traditional lender's probably going to be first in line to get their money if something goes wrong. And we understand that, and we're willing to take that lower lien position. These were all things I learned as we went through the process that really ended up enhancing that overall sort of capital stack and the pro forma eventually of that particular capital campaign and the one that we've just finished.
Yeah, I think that flexibility component of a non-traditional bank like a CDFI or a loan fund like us allows some of that. We have some requirements, but we can be a little bit more agile and pivot when necessary. And to your point, Sia, earlier, that's where we partner with our banks, right? Like, we want to work with those banks to make sure the project comes to fruition because, number one, it benefits impact, which we care most about. but it also impacts the way we get repaid, right? So we want to make sure we work closely with those financial institutions to ensure that Stacy's successful carries successful with their projects.
Thank you, Tammy. And Ben, were you about to say anything?
No, I think they covered that quite well.
All right, so we know that our government has reopened the Paycheck Protection Program with the second stimulus package. What are some of the challenges that are faced by nonprofits when applying for the previous rollout, and how can they, or what can they do to prepare for this the second time around?
I'm going to lean on Ben to share his perspective on, because I know you did a lot of data and got a lot of feedback from your members. I'd love for you to share it. And then, of course, as a PPP provider, I'm happy to share sort of our experiences. But I'd love to hear, Ben, you share just kind of what you guys heard from members.
Well, it sort of came in stages, right? As the PPP program was being developed and announced, and some information was coming out, nonprofits were like, is this something we can be a part of? Can we be a part? Can we apply for this? Are we counted as small businesses for this? And once more regulations and information came out, said yes, this is applicable for nonprofit organizations, and there was this big buzz about, do we do this, or do we do the EIDL advance, the economic injury disaster loan advance? Can we do the two together? And so from our perspective together, I see we were sifting through massive amounts of information, trying to determine what the truth was. And all the meanwhile, nobody could apply for anything because the Small Business Administration hadn't finished getting things ready for banks to even get into the process. And so everybody was sort of like, it was a hurry up and wait kind of thing. And then once the first applications opened, then it was a who can get it to you first kind of rush. People were saying, well, which bank is already going ahead and taking applications? Who's getting checks out and things like that? And for a lot of organizations, this is their first loan of any kind, either the EIDL loan or the PPP. And so there's also, we were getting questions about how do we even account for this? Like, what does this look like in our books? Since it's going to be forgivable, do we really need to record it as a liability? Do we just record it straight as revenue? And I was like, no. It needs to be recorded as a liability, even if it's short term. You have to do these things in the right proper order. And so we were providing technical assistance about all that, and folks were getting their applications in, and they were getting access to the loan. Then we had the South Carolina CARES Act fund that came out, and folks were like, okay, yeah, here's another bit of money we can access that's not loan based. And then what we found out is that after all the applications got in, was that they would not be granting from that fund to any organization that had already received funding from PPP. And so there was some distress about that. But I think the good news out of that was that what's coming up in this upcoming PPP round is the need to show that the organization had a loss in revenue of a certain amount in any given quarter, year over year, quarter over quarter. And that math for those organizations who applied for the SC CARES fund, you've already done that math. You've already done that calculation in order to apply for it. So I look forward to taking our materials from that experience and just flipping them over into the next round of PPP. I hope that the lending institutions, having already gone through this once, are in a much better position to help organizations get access to this funding for the second round.
Yeah, and I'll just add again, I think, it's a good problem to have. We had a great relief package that came from the feds that was immediately available. The bad news was we were building the plane while we were flying it. I mean, both for not only the federal government, SBA, and their team worked, I know, tirelessly, but the banks as well as small organizations like ours. We are a PPP provider. We did $2.6 million in PPP. Of course, that was also working with small businesses and nonprofits and some churches as well. We also worked with churches. We are currently open for PPP. The first round, if you hadn't received a Paycheck Protection loan in last year, you could be eligible now. There is also what they're calling the second draw PPP, which is if you got a PPP before, you can now ask for a second draw of PPP. And so it has some different stipulations. As Ben was mentioning, they are now looking at loss of gross receipts. And so for nonprofits, if you can compare from 2019 to 2020 that you had a reduction in income or revenue due to the fact that you know certain grants weren't available to you. If you do a lot of fundraising or a lot of events that you generate your income from, that may make you eligible for this second round. And so one of the recommendations that we're telling clients right now is if you already worked with a financial institution for your first PPP, go back to them first. Their portal will be open soon. And so because, for example, if you worked with Wells Fargo, they already have your file, they already have everything, you already have a relationship with them. So that will make it a little bit easier for you. Like you were saying, Ben, the process can be quite cumbersome, but once you get the documentation, it can be quite simple. And so that would be one recommendation I would have for folks on the call that are interested in applying for either the first round, or the second round to work with your banking if you have a banking relationship. If you don't, certainly you can reach out to us here at Community Works. In addition, they did open the program up this time to 501c6s. So I know there was a lot of discussion on membership organizations, housing cooperatives, chambers of commerces, things like that were not eligible for the first round. And so they did open it up for that. They've also increased the eligibility. And so again, it was to be a job preserver, right? To retain jobs, to make sure that you can stay in business. And so again, a large percentage of the money available for PPP was for payroll. Some funds could be used for utilities, mortgages, and rent, but it was a smaller percentage. This time they're opening it up to include operation expenditures, property damage. So because of some of the civil unrest and some of the things that happened across the country, during March and the summer, that's an eligible opportunity. Supplier costs, worker protection expenditures like PPE. So there's some additional eligible opportunities this round, just for folks to know. And I know we're going to share Sadia, our contact information, our website information later, because I've got a lot of this on the website. I'd say for us at Community Works, the challenge for some of the nonprofits specifically, and even our small businesses, was the way that you count your employees. And so a lot of people came to us and said, I have 20 employees. And we're like, okay, send us your 941 reports, or send us your tax returns to tell us how many employees you have. And you had 18 employees. Well, the reason you had 18 employees is because you had 2 contractors, or you had 2 consultants that you paid on a 1099, which is, they're not your employees, they're contract employees. And so a lot of us explaining that to individuals, or if I'm a hairstylist as a small business and I do a Schedule C and I contract out with 5 other stylists in my salon, they're not your employees, right? They are your contract. And so they can apply under a Schedule C, but they're not your company's employees. So that was some information that we really had to educate people on. And then I think, Ben, to your point, making sure that folks did know that this was a loan. And just like if you do a forgivable loan, Carrie, you probably do forgivable loans for housing. As long as you meet certain parameters, it will be forgiven, but you have to meet those parameters. And until you meet those parameters, it is a liability to the organization.
Absolutely. That's some good information, Tammy. Thank you. Sometimes with nonprofits and even with small businesses, we know that debt may not be the way to go. You may not be in a position to take on any type of debt. So if you guys could talk about maybe alternative types of financing, not necessarily debt, but just different types of financing you've used within your organization to meet your mission.
So we love a forgivable loan, which I know is technically debt, but as long as you meet that criteria. And then where we've been able to tap into some particularly because of the partnerships, things like the Federal Home Loan Bank, which Carrie's probably familiar with if you're in the housing world, being able to access funds by working with a partner bank or a partner lender that brings those funds into your project again early on, if it's a construction project as an example. And then once you've met that criteria, it essentially acts like a loan. And so, I mean, it acts like a grant. And that's, you know, that's where being that 501c3 does give you sort of that competitive edge. And we're doing the work of affordable housing and other things that the traditional for-profit world doesn't always embrace. So I think that's kind of been one example for us, is really being able to leverage other opportunities because of those relationships. And I think, you know, not just with PPP, but I think what we learned during PPP is that banking relation, and this is kind of off topic, sorry, Sadia, it's kind of, but that banking relationship is so important so that you aren't starting from scratch. And so we work with several banks, so we had a couple of opportunities, but they've already got your 990, they've already got your annual report, they've already got your audit, because you do have that relationship. And I think regardless of size, really developing that relationship over time with where you're doing your deposits or where you have your credit cards, it gives you some shorthand when an opportunity like that, hopefully we're not dealing with a COVID type opportunity again, but when an opportunity like this or some other opportunity comes up, you've already got that relationship. And that was really driven home for us during PPP because we had two really strong banking relationships, and we basically, I'm not, you know, we played both ends against the middle to see whose portal opened first. You know, we were working in both portals. And then, but it just really did cut down on what we had to send in because both of those banks had already vetted us. So that really, gone are the days of kind of the corner banker. I feel like Community Loan Fund is our local banker. We have that relationship. They understand our mission. But even with the larger banks, having the banker, you know, that individual who understands you, maybe they're on your board, or maybe their mother helped write your bylaws when you were founded, but there's some connection there, even in those larger institutions. And managing those relationships, just like anything else, in good times. And then you have a much better leg up during crisis.
Yeah, I would add, Stacy, to that. I mean, remember, every single one of you probably on this call, if you're a nonprofit, has a deposit somewhere. So, right. You know, the banks want you to be a depository partner. They want you to, you know, facilitate that client base. So again, building that relationship is important because, I mean, as nonprofits, you know, we have financial responsibilities. In many cases, it's to secure our funding in a financial institution that's insured. And so whether it's a credit union or a traditional bank. And so again, you kind of have a leg up because you have, you know, you're providing those deposits and those relationship opportunities as well. So, and I would also say, don't be afraid to reach out to your foundation partners. They can really play an interesting role in supporting your financial requests. And so maybe you don't have the kind of collateral. I know, Stacey, you were doing real estate development, Carrie, you're doing, so a lot of times real estate can be easier because it's can collateralize the loan. But if I'm a service provider and I really don't have, you know, a lot of collateral besides my cash position, and certainly, you know, a personal guarantee for a nonprofit is a much harder thing to ask for. You'd be asking your board to take on some personal guarantee, which is another conversation with boards, right? And so a lot of times that's what we look at as a personal guarantee if the collateral doesn't match the loan. But foundations can act as a credit enhancement for you. Maybe they say, hey, you know, we care so much about this direct service program, you know, we'll help you get the loan, we'll back it or guarantee it and sign some sort of a agreement with you. So that, I mean, just think creatively, even with your foundation partners, about how you can access credit.
Yeah, and I think to Stacy's point too, just to kind of elaborate more on that, if you're working with more than one banks, that shouldn't really be a secret. That kind of creates some type of competition, and not in a nasty way by any means, but you know, using more than one lender expands your portfolio a little bit, and it makes you more competitive, not only to other banks, but the banks that you're using, because they know that they're not your one and only a source. I would also say for Grand Strand Housing in particular, we're a 501c4, so we donating to us is not as a you know, highly incentivized for people who are donating. So we kind of have to work with other organizations and see, like, if people have donated materials, if we can use those you know, in times of need, when we're replacing things in rental units, if Habitat for Humanity has things that people have donated, I would say collaborating with your local partners to see what kind of things that they have. You know, we mainly do have to use debt and grants just strictly, but forgivable loans as well. So reaching out for all of those types of things.
Thank you, Carrie. And Ben, did you want to say anything, or I don't want to start with another question before letting you talk?
I'll just make a note about the relationship building, because I mean, that's very important for nonprofits, no matter where they are and what they're doing and how big they are, how small they are, and I think this is true for any vendor. You want to shop around, you know, I'll just say, from a small organization's perspective, for a lot of these vendors, losing your business is not going to be a huge hit for them, and so their perspective shifts more to a kind of a weird alignment with your mission, because they're like, well, what can we do to help you? Because you're a small organization. You know, if we're not able to help you, who can we help get you to help you? And that happened with us. You know, our main bank was not able to get us in. And so they said, you know, let's see if we can get you connected with one of our others, our partners here, competitors here, if they can get you in, because they might be able to help you faster than we can. And so, but that improved our relationship with both, because it said, okay, you know, our main bank is looking out for us and giving us the heads up, and that was very appreciated. So I think this may be easier for smaller organizations, that those vendors can be more focused on your mission as well, because you're not a huge part of the balance sheet.
Yeah, once you kind of get a relationship built, most banks they focus on your mission as well. It's just starting that conversation, starting that relationship, getting past just the bottom line and the numbers, and then it really creates kind of just a different environment, a different financial environment beyond just numbers.
Well, and I think remembering that banks have community reinvestment goals, and how, just like with a donor, we help the donor meet their philanthropic goals. But if you're a bank that needs those credits, and you're, you know, watching out for meaningful projects, that it doesn't have to be so one-sided. I mean, there is something, obviously there's interest in fees and things like that, but beyond that, there are benefits to the bank to work with organizations like ours. We help them meet other criteria, as those heavily, you know, as Tammy was saying, heavily regulated institutions. And so often they have goals that they're not meeting, that they can come in and work with you and meet and help your project. And now you're meeting a different goal for them, that's a little bit more on their philanthropic side, and not just the lending side. You know, working with them just like any other donor, there are benefits to both of us. It shouldn't be such a lopsided relationship, and we shouldn't go in feeling like we're pitiful and we're begging them to do us a favor. It is very much a business transaction. They're helping us meet our goals. We're helping them meet their goals. We kind of forget that and want to play the pitiful card. And, you know, just as an industry, that's a thing we all need to come over, you know, get over. We're not pitiful. We're nonprofit. And so, again, that's our tax status and not our business plan. But don't think there's not a benefit to the bank outside of just the fees, from working with organizations like ours. It's a huge benefit.
I would agree with you, Stacy, and thanks for reiterating that business strategy. You know, we exist because someone else is not providing a service to the market, right? And so we're market service providers. I mean, of course, we know where our hearts are, where our passion is, what we're focused on at the end of the day, you know, who we're serving and why we're serving them. But we are delivering something that someone else is not delivering, and reiterating that. And again, and so being able to go to a financial institution and get credit, and I think this is part of educating your board, just like you said, Stacy, board members shouldn't put their business hat off when they enter your nonprofit board meeting. They should be putting it on, because their goal is to make sure you have, you know, you're financially stable and successful in delivering your service. So I think it is important to think about that. And I think the sooner you start to build that rapport and that credit with banks, when you really need them, then they'll be that those, again, we saw with COVID relief funding, more and more need for lines of credit because folks knew funds were coming down, whether that be for tenant rental assistance or utility assistance or whatever the assistance was. But as you know, the feds never work that fast, nor does the local government work that fast. And so being able to access knowing that you've got a contract, knowing that you've got some funds coming down would allow you to immediately deliver that relief. And so, don't shy away from being prepared for that.
Thank you, Tammy. And with Community Works, we know that you guys, just like us, you have a great affordable housing loan product. We know that affordable housing is a really big issue here in South Carolina. So what ways have you helped provide funding for nonprofits that work in the affordable housing area?
Yeah, so we've done everything from, again, providing a small nonprofit that's just doing infill housing, acquiring, rehabbing, and renting housing here in Greenville, Allen Temple, organizations like that, local small CDCs, to have some of those funds to get access those properties. And then, we get repaid based on the rents that are received, probably similar to what Carrie's doing at Grandstand, all the way up to larger affordable housing development projects that are funded through multiple, layers of financing, low-income housing tax credits, 4% tax credits, so larger multifamily units where we may come in as the last money to fill the gap. I mean, for example, we did a project here in Spartanburg, the North Side neighborhood, where we were able to provide a $750,000 loan to the project. It was about 11 layers of financing and to help make that project feasible. And it took the pressure off the nonprofit in the North Side to not have to come up with that money themselves, and bringing community development, bringing a CDFI in to actually fill that gap in financing that was a $11 million project, right? Or and so again, everything from small nonprofits that are just doing 1 or 2 developments that just need that line of credit to actually acquire, rehab, and resale. Because you guys know, I mean, some of you are in Charleston, some of you are in the upstate, some are in Columbia. I mean, if you don't have access to quick capital, in many cases, to acquire some of these properties in these very sensitive neighborhoods that are feeling pressure from gentrification, the market's going to gobble those up. And so a lot of nonprofits are looking for that line of credit where they can easily acquire and preserve affordable housing in communities. And that's another way that we've been able to help nonprofits with that kind of line of credit. And so we've also offered lines of credit for COVID to nonprofits directly, either 50,000 up to 250,000. And I know, Sadia, you guys are going to share some information later from our websites, but that may be, again, a way that nonprofits need immediate money to meet those needs. And so that's something that I know you've done and we've done as well.
Absolutely. And let me ask, Carrie, do you guys offer loan products for with the CDC?
No, we don't offer any loan products. We have been lucky enough to not really have any issues with collecting rent during this time. But what we do is we have forgivable loans that extend to those who receive housing rehab, a restrictive covenant for them through our federal funding sources. And then our rental houses, we don't know.
Okay. Just wanted to.
We do provide, as it relates to housing, Sadia, we do provide down payment assistance. So working with local partners, Greenville, Prisma Hospital System, Spartanburg, and GCRA here. So in some cases, we are working with homeowners, not necessarily for the mortgages, but we're working with down payment assistance. So some of our nonprofits work with us to get their homeowners access to that.
Okay, awesome. I think we're going to just go ahead and take some questions from the audience. Kelly?
Yeah, we have 2 questions. First question, thank you for holding this webinar. Is it a common thing for nonprofits to help for-profits get grant money that is earned or that is earmarked for nonprofits? An example via fiscal sponsorship. I've been told the Nonprofit who does this typically gets 10% of grant funds obtained.
So the question, what's the percentage of a fiscal agent? Is that the question, do you think? I think it can depend. I mean, there's some rule of thumb if you're a fiscal sponsor of a nonprofit organization, but it's usually based on either the grant amount or the asset size of the nonprofit. In some cases, I mean, that can be negotiated with your fiscal sponsor if that's the question that's being asked. But I'm not sure if that exactly was what you're asking. But usually there is some rule of thumb out there. And Stacey, I don't know if you've ever acted as a fiscal sponsor for anyone. I know we have in the past in different nonprofits I've worked with. But sometimes there's sort of a rate out there, and then there's a negotiated rate.
Well, and I think I don't know if the question was, so a 501c3 goes to get a grant for something a for-profit wants to do. As an example for us on our project, our affordable housing project, which will be a separate LLC, which is a for-profit company, 180 Place will receive Federal Home Loan Bank as an example, or a grant from a foundation, and then we will loan that to the for-profit. Now, we're a partner in that development. It's a little bit different because it's not, it is somewhat hand in glove, but that will show up as soft debt for the larger project, but it'll show up on our books as a loan to that project. And we'll have to work through all the details. I don't know if that was the question, but that's an example of our 573 meeting partners, affordable housing development, can't go get an FHLB grant or can't go get, trying to think of another grant, a South Carolina Housing Trust grant. You have to be that 501c3. So we're the conduit for those funds, and then it passes through to that for-profit project. I don't know if that was the question. We've certainly done the fiscal sponsor thing. We've never been lucky enough to sponsor anybody that could pay us, so we don't really do that anymore. But
well, I think part of the question too, at the beginning, it sounded like if it was a normal relationship for the two to kind of come together. And like with South Carolina Housing Trust Fund, you generally have to have a certain amount of experience. So you don't necessarily have to be a nonprofit in all cases with that particular funding source, but you do have to have some level of experience. So Grand Strand Housing has been able to kind of be an experience arm as well. And that definitely creates some form of a percentage or some form of payment, once the project is complete sometimes, or however that's structured. But it's an absolutely normal relationship to have, and sometimes one needs the other, and the other, a nonprofit may need a for-profit, and a for-profit may need a nonprofit.
So Together SC actually does serve as a fiscal sponsor for other smaller associations that have a similar mission and purpose, but might be more dedicated to a certain area or to a certain portion of the nonprofit sector. And I'll agree with Stacey. It's kind of, sometimes it's like, well, the fees that we could get off of that are not enormous. And it is based on an agreement and on a contract that is negotiated. And there may be certain grants that the sponsored entity receives that it's in those grant stipulations that a percentage of this cannot be used to pay for a fiscal sponsor or for anything else like that. And so we just kind of have to deal with it. So it's highly dependent on the circumstances. I don't think there's really a one-size-fits-all rule about fiscal sponsorship.
Got it. All right, we have one more question here. To the CDFIs on the line, how long is the process, or what is the turnaround time on a LOC application?
A line of credit. So number one important component of this is once we have all of your documentation, which requires, and we can make sure that folks interested in this get this, or it's also on our website, but there's certain documentation that we need to do the underwriting. And so the number one thing is a complete application. Just think of it like you're applying for a grant and the deadline is a certain deadline, and you have to have every single attachment associated, your 990, your board members, your policies, your bylaws, your incorporation, your project, what you're asking the money for. I mean, just every single thing that you would do for a grant and asking for those funds is probably what we're going to ask you for. And so again, once we get that documentation, we start underwriting. Internally, it should not take but about 30 days, depending on the size of the request. We have to take that to a loan committee. So not unlike a financial institution, we only have certain authority individually to approve. We take it to a loan committee and then take it to board. So it could take 90 days. But then again, if it's a line of credit, once you get approved for that $250,000 line of credit and you're buying one house and then revolving it, the goal is that you would have access to draw down those funds as you needed them. And so once we get through that initial process, but my big caveat is once we have a completed application, the process can be a lot quicker. So.
Yeah, and we actually do not offer a line of credit. We only do installment loans. And we typically tell a client that 60 to 90 days. And again, just piggybacking off of Tammy, we stress that it's from the time we receive a completed application. So a lot of times I tell my clients that, you know, it's all based, a lot of it's based on your readiness as far as where you are in your project. So you may be in the idea phase, or you may be starting out and you may not have everything that you need to have a complete package, or you may just not be ready at this time, and we'll let you know, what things you need to do and what steps you need to take to get there. But typically, in a perfect world, about 60 to 90 days. That's what we usually say. But we don't offer, like I said, a line of credit. We just do installment loans.
And I think you both made good points about, well, this goes back to that relationship thing too. If you're applying for a big competitive grant, a deadline is a deadline, and you don't have the documentation, you're disqualified. When you're working with a true partner who understands, well, the loan committee meets next week, but then they meet again in 30 days, 60 days. So get me this, and we potentially can still carry it forward. Not to say that you're not, operating some aspects maybe on a competitive basis, but that to me is one of the beautiful things about working with a South Carolina Community Loan for a Community Work is that it's much more like working with a program officer in a large foundation. They want you to succeed. A federal grant, they're looking for ways to disqualify people. And if you didn't meet the deadline, you're dead in the water. Being able to have that back and forth to say, based on what you just submitted, you might be ready in 6 months, or maybe you'll be ready in a year. That really doesn't happen in the grant world. And so that is, I think, a beautiful thing about having a lender with good money who understands, and you're really doing that back and forth versus they're just not trying to cut you out of the loop to have fewer applications to review from the beginning.
Right. And when we go back to saying, making sure you have a completed application, it's, you may send a tax return and you may send 1 or 2 bank statements, but if you're missing things in that package, we can't fully underwrite your file and really make an informed decision if we don't have all of the documentation we need. And then sometimes even when we say, well, you need these 10 items, we may come back and say, well, we need 5 more. And you guys are like, oh God. But it's, part of the underwriting process is so that we can make an informed decision when underwriting the loan.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, we want to be as flexible as possible. We want to be as nimble as possible. I mean, we have called special committee meetings. We've called special board meetings. I called 5 special meetings this 2020 just to get things approved for projects that we're concerned about getting to the finish line. And so, we can do that. We have the flexibility to do that. Our board, has been really wonderful about that. But again, if we don't have all the information that we need, because what we're doing is we're trying to get you a yes. And we want to have everything that we have available to us to make sure we can get you the yes that you need. And so we can present it to our board to make them say like, oh, this is a no-brainer. Of course we're going to do this loan, So just remember that we're your champions, but we do have some folks that make some final decisions for us.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, that is all the questions we have. And we're about to approach 2 o'clock. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who attended, and a big thank you to our panelists and moderator. Big round of applause. Thank you all. Our next summit series will be on February 10th, and we'll be discussing how rural communities can create resources for their citizens. And you can find more information on that in the handouts tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. So please make sure to click those handouts now before we close out, so you can have access to the contact information as well as information about our future Summit Series sessions. I also want to remind everyone that our final session is in March, and we have a special keynote speaker, Mirsa Baradaran, who is the author of The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. She has been featured a lot recently in the much growing discussion about wealth disparities in the United States. And she was recently named an advisor for President-elect Joe Biden's economic transition team. So we are thrilled to have her, and we're very excited to see what she has to say in March. And the information for that session is also in the handouts panel. So please download those handouts. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. And we hope to see